Joining me now is civil rights lawyer Shahid Buttar. He's the executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and former director of its program against racial and religious profiling. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, President Obama did say during his presidential campaign, in fact, he promised that he would abandon the more egregious provisions of the so-called war on terror. And here we are 9 years later, and most of them are still in place. So to what extent have civil liberties been compromised in this country?
Dramatically. This country, the United States, in 2010 bears very little resemblance in some respects to the country that preceded the 9/11 attacks. And I think one of the great tragedies of those attacks are not just the loss of life on that day, but the damage has been wrought to our Constitution since. And whereas at one point in time, the Patriot Act, pervasive surveillance, arbitrary detention without trial, executive secrecy, compromising democratic transparency principles, at one point these were Bush-era abuses, but now under the Obama administration they have become, at least for now, entrenched features of what used to be, I think, American democracy.
And there's something else that's very evident. I mean, you mentioned surveillance, you mentioned secrecy, which has got a little bit worse, I think, under the Obama administration. It's also accountability. There's been nobody brought to book, no accountability here.
That's right. I think transparency is useful to a democracy precisely because it is a precursor to accountability. It's only when a populace knows what its government is doing that the people responsible for those decisions can then be held to account. And unfortunately, both stages here have been compromised. I think with respect to executive transparency, that's a bit of a nuanced picture because on the first day in office, the Obama White House did shift the presumptions on FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and that was a step in the right direction. However, on every point, essentially, where transparency has really mattered, transparency into the mounting evidence of torture against detainees, transparency into the ways in which telecom companies have profited from the derogation of individual privacy rights at the behest of the FBI under Patriot Act powers, all of these issues have been insulated from transparency. And in fact, just this very week, an en-banc panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals demonstrating a problem with respect to judicial independence deferred to the executive and said that claims that the CIA's extraordinary rendition program constituted a state secret that could not be aired in court, that claim was sustained, and the executive effort to use secrecy as a barrier to accountability, in fact, to preclude accountability by hiding its own criminal trail, that was reestablished not just by the executive, but in this case by the judiciary.
And when we look at the erosion of civil liberties in the United States, it appears that the Democrats and the Republicans now in opposition, appear to be on the same page. So that leaves very little choice for voters who want the situation to change. But looking at the other side of that, do you think most Americans support these policies?
Absolutely not. And I think that, just to say two things about what you'd said, I think it demonstrates in one respect another problem with American democracy, and that voters did vote to make a change. And yet you see none in Washington, and the institutional unresponsiveness to the popular electoral mandate, I think, is very interesting to observe. And I think it's quite clear that Americans across the ideological spectrum reject pervasive surveillance secrecy. You can see this, for instance, in the work that some organizations have done, including my own, in 2002 to 2006. Over 400 towns, 8 states across the country officially rejected the Patriot Act in their official capacities, and these were not all progressive bastions. It was the state of Idaho, the state of Alaska, the state of Maine, alongside the state of California. It was Dallas, Texas, alongside San Francisco, California. And I think that whether from a libertarian perspective on the right or a progressive perspective on the left, there has been widespread disaffection and alienation of grassroots, law-abiding, constitutionalist Americans who have been not represented and, in fact, sold out by both of the major parties here in Washington.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.